Welcome again, everybody, to Efficiency Canada's bi-weekly DiscoverEE webinar. If you've never been here before, this is a webinar that Efficiency Canada has been hosting for several years now. And basically the goal of the webinar is to invite speakers from across Canada working in the energy efficiency sector to share research, case studies, innovation, cool new projects that they've been doing, and basically just help to build an understanding and build an awareness of the importance of the energy efficiency sector to Canada and how dynamic and exciting it is. So welcome. We're glad you're here. I'm James Gady, Director of Research at Efficiency Canada. I'm based in Waterloo, Southern Ontario, which is the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral peoples. I am pleased to be here. We've had a bit of a late game substitution, actually. If you came expecting to see a presentation from Trim Tab, unfortunately, that is going to be rescheduled for another day. But I'm pleased to welcome Efficiency Canada's Senior Policy Strategy Director, Brendan Haley, who is going to present on some really new and breaking research that we've been doing at Efficiency Canada. Brendan and our colleague, Carol Moss, have been working in the last several weeks, months, doing research to answer a question. And the question is basically, how can we understand or define or understand energy efficiency as a made in Canada resource? So I'm pleased that Brendan's here to present the results of this research. We're just putting the finishing touches on the actual report, which we expect will be published in the coming weeks. So please keep an eye out on our website and our news releases, or our email news releases, so that you can learn when this report has been published and read the full thing. So without further ado, I think I will just pass it to Brendan. Brendan, you can share your screen and we'll get started.
Great. All right, the screen is sharing. So hey everyone, as James said, this is like an impromptu thing, so happy to present some work we've been doing. So remember a few months ago when the world went crazy, when Donald Trump took office and trade war was triggered, or lots of uncertainty, et cetera, et cetera. So when that happened, we were thinking, okay, what should we do? What's our role as Efficiency Canada? The actual tariff amounts and what products they would go on, that seemed quite volatile. If you're following yesterday's news, it's even volatile today. But the one thing that appeared to be clearer was that policymakers in Canada, I think, would be focused on building a more self-reliant economy, more resilient economy, less dependent on US production systems and markets. So at first blush, or if we just stick with first principles, energy efficiency is a very homegrown solution. It essentially involves taking local actions to save energy that reduce the need for energy imports, or we can free up some of our domestic energy resources to be used for better, more productive purposes. So the resource is local, right? It's in our buildings, it's in our cars, hot water tanks, domestic industries, appliances, etc. It's also tends to be installed by local contractors, local tradespeople. We've got macroeconomic modeling we did a number of years ago that's relevant to this. It shows that energy efficiency frees up dollars that then circulate in local economies while giving an initial boost to sectors domestically like construction, professional services, and retail trade. But we are good researchers, always trying to ask questions. We thought we need to take a closer look because there are materials used often in energy efficiency. There's products, there's services. Those have supply chains, and we wanted to understand, are there any trade dependencies associated with those supply chains? Might they create certain vulnerabilities or dependencies in the Canadian economy? Yeah, so what I'm presenting today as a kind of last minute thing is a bit of a sneak peek thoughts and findings on a report that Carol Moss and I have been working on. And what we did is we took on a fairly ambitious task of delving into the nature of different energy efficiency supply chains, or what you might call value chains. And we spent a lot of time trying to understand those. And a lot of it is about physical products, right? Those physical products that can be traded across borders and therefore perhaps tariffed. But before I get into that, I think it's really important to step back and recognize some important characteristics of energy efficiency strategies and, say, portfolios. And the first characteristic is that there's a huge diversity of ways to save energy, of demand side solutions available, right? If you think of programs, there's residential, commercial, industrial programs. There's not just one type of insulation. There's many types of insulation. There are many different ways to configure commercial HVAC systems or industrial operations. So there's such a diversity of those demand side solutions available, of the associated players in Canada who do that work. As researchers, we finally had to just stop and recognize that there's a lot of technologies, products, companies, strategies that we're just not going to be able to explore. That made it almost nearly impossible to explore everything. But the other takeaway from that is that there's a large diversity of ways to improve energy efficiency, which means it is quite an adaptable energy resource option. And so in these turbulent and uncertain economic times, a kind of inherently adaptable energy option like that should be highly valued. So when we think about efficiency strategies, how can we take advantage of that flexibility? Having a wider portfolio of solutions is going to allow you to do that instead of, say, maybe like single programs or single technologies. So a second characteristic is that I think is quite important is that there's a whole bunch of ways to save energy that require little to no material inputs, that instead optimize existing energy systems, that find operational efficiencies with, say, existing pieces of equipment. So those strategies can even extend the lifetime of your equipment or of your products. And so if you're a business right now, you might find that quite useful. You might be quite worried about the implications of a piece of equipment breaking down and needing to import it. So programs like retro commissioning, strategic energy management, they can accomplish energy savings again with little to no material requirements. And as we've got modern computing power, we've got more data-driven energy savings, that's more and more possible. So that's a really important point, I think. A lot of operational saving strategies are fairly tariff-proof. So another just aspect of that, when we think about the more intangible nature of our economies, we thought about, okay, what about the role of intellectual property? There are prominent theories today that argue that it's the ownership and control of data and of intellectual property. That is how nations are achieving a lot of power in global economies. And it's actually the United States over decades that has been quite active in gaining monopoly power over knowledge products and over services. And they've been arranging things like trade deals to protect that monopoly power over knowledge products, more so than, say, over physical production. We can get a bit of a read in this. What I'm showing here is just the distribution of clean energy patents that have been claimed by Canadians over the past decade or so. And it's interesting that industrial energy efficiency and substitution is the largest category. Building energy efficiency is not too far behind. And when we went in to explore supply chains and different Canadian companies, we see Canadian companies patenting in areas like industrial pump and motor systems, recycling technology, heat recovery ventilation, heat exchange technologies. We also see proprietary technologies that are owned by international companies, and that might create some barriers for their use in Canada. So we're leaving that as something to perhaps be explored a bit further. But I think it's an important point to make that protectionism and economic power struggles, they exist in the ownership of knowledge and data, and not just on tariffing physical products. Okay, so trying to answer a question, is something made in Canada or not? That's a complex question. So what I'm presenting here is an attempt to simplify it dramatically of what is a story of every single supply chain actually being quite messy and complex oftentimes. So we have 4 columns here with these little dots on them. The first column is asking if the product or service can be purchased from Canadian-owned companies, or at least companies that have significant senior management and office presence in Canada. And on almost all of these subcategories or subproducts of energy efficiency, the answer is yes. We have a second column that is on if there's a significant amount of manufacturing or assembly that occurs in Canada. Then we looked at key production inputs and if they are largely sourced in Canada or sourced elsewhere. And then finally, again, very important, is we did our best to track examples or find examples of Canadian innovation, creation of new companies, ownership of intellectual property, because that can determine your ability to capture value or have strength in global production networks. So the report tells the qualitative story, goes into the details of what this table is showing and what the little dots are. I definitely want to caveat this, that the story we're telling with these dots of if, it's significant less common or there's significant potential is what we'd call stylized facts, getting the story mostly right, but recognizing that there are likely exceptions, right? We did not do a census of all energy efficiency companies and supply chains. We talked to energy efficiency experts and industry players. We tried to understand the general dynamics and get the right story. So the report actually does provide some important exceptions. So for instance, there are examples of residential heat pump assembly occurring in Canada, in Quebec and New Brunswick, for instance, but we don't see that as a dominant dynamic. So I'll just walk you through a couple examples in the table. Cellulosic insulation. That is a very local production process. The inputs largely come from cardboard recycling, and the equipment to manufacture and package the product is also produced by a Quebec-based company named Premier Tech. We look at fiberglass and mineral wool insulation. Those are products mostly produced by multinational companies, largely headquartered outside of Canada, but they all have significant manufacturing footprints in Canada serving the Canadian market. So if we think about Rockwool, it has 2 out of 3 of its North American manufacturing facilities in Canada. We counted at least 12 insulation manufacturing facilities in Canada for fiberglass. If we move down to residential heat pumps, this, I think, I'd like to talk about kind of how we thought about it more, how we thought about the question of Canadian advantage and involvement in different types of production systems, and asking whether a heat pump is manufactured in Canada or not. That again is it's a bit of a tricky question because it's essentially a box with a whole bunch of different components, and a lot of those components are mature and they're sourced internationally. So if we think about air-to-air mini splits, this is an area where Chinese manufacturing economies of scale are very much at play. So in a global production system like that, I think it makes a lot of sense to ask about what's the ability to capture value, to gain some advantage in global supply chains. And so there's lots of ways you can do that. You could become a more sophisticated buyer, for instance. So heat pumps largely are not assembled or manufactured here, but we do have Canadian distributors and specific Canadian brands that can engage in things like bulk purchasing. They do things like negotiating adaptations to the Canadian market. And then the kind of final dot there was examples of Canadian innovation or business creation or intellectual property. And yeah, we see examples of Canadian companies combining heat pumps with, say, like energy storage or ventilation services. We see innovation examples. There's a U of T spinoff company named Enersion. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that, but it's trying to remove the need for refrigerants from heat pumps using nanoporous materials. So that's more the story of when you're in like a global production system, how can we think about what's happening in Canada versus not? And we think it's a very similar story in energy use in larger commercial and industrial systems. These are also global production networks where things are sourced internationally. But in pretty much every instance, there's a need for application of Canadian engineering expertise. And so we have lots of Canadian companies with business models that are built around things like, say, using natural refrigerants. We see examples like Armstrong Fluid Technology that's competing against global motor and pump manufacturers. They've got intellectual property in the digitization of those systems. So that's the kind of stuff we looked for. And then finally, I think the smart thermostat story is a pretty good one, I think, for Canada. We've got companies like Ecobee, which was acquired, but still has a large presence in Canada. We've got Misa. Those are companies developing smart thermostats. They're competing against international players. And the value added there is really in the design and the marketing, with manufacturing occurring largely in Asia. Okay, almost every product is traded to some extent. So we wanted to see if there are any kind of key trade dependencies or challenges we should look out for. And here are just some examples of a couple stories. One type of insulation that is spray foam insulation. Some of the feedstocks there, like the MDI feedstock, we think is largely sourced from Texas oil and gas refining. The supply of low carbon blowing agents used in spray foam, largely sourced from the United States right now. However, we see there are potential trade diversification options available for those inputs if needed. When we look at windows, the main issue with windows is that Canada is one of the top importers of float glass, and 90% of those imports come from the United States. But it's also an export market concern because we actually have a trade surplus with the US on at least plastic windows, and a lot of those exports go to the States. And if we looked at air-to-air heat pumps, there's a potential interesting trade diversification story there. If you think about who supplies furnaces, a lot of those companies are mostly American. We look at least mini split heat pumps, a lot of them are manufactured in China, Korea, Japan, as well as some heat pumps manufactured in Europe. We look at residential water heat pumps. We couldn't find an example of a manufacturer in Canada. There's a manufacturer of kind of more like resistance water heaters in Canada. We find in that manufacturing is increasingly moving to Mexico. And then if we look at smart thermostats, this is like a market loss story potentially. Like at least the trade data shows that 90% of thermostat exports go to the United States. So losing that market could be a challenge. Okay, so the other thing we did in this report is we outlined strategies or opportunities to increase self-reliance, to increase resilience by using local inputs, by diversifying trade, or by supporting domestic innovation. So how can we do this even better? How can we do it even more? So quick stories, insulation. If we want that to be even more local, we can increase recycling, and recycling in a whole bunch of different materials like cardboard, glass, plastic, styrofoam. But we should also consider a potential Canadian advantage in using agricultural byproducts and using wood fibers, other types of bio-based forms of insulation like hemp. That should be intriguing Canadian, opportunity. When we think of air barriers, you can get those in Canada. Using higher performance air barriers could tend to move us away from the kind of more standardized DuPont house wraps. That could move us to more European products or Canadian products. We think about windows. We could increase local inputs there by recycling PVC that's already in our borders. We just recycle it, reuse it. And we did pick up on discussions about bringing float glass manufacturing perhaps linked to Canada. There's sand deposits in Manitoba where that's being discussed. And the business case for doing that is probably going to focus on a strategy around using Canadian renewable energy and also having a high efficiency production process. Heat pumps. I think the no regret strategy with heat pumps is to coordinate demand so that we can become a more sophisticated buyer, or bring some assembly on within our borders. That's also a potential. So we could diversify trade both with Asian countries and potentially European countries if we say follow their lead in allowing low carbon refrigerant heat pumps. But again, I think this is an area where Canada should think about how do we add value? How do we gain advantage? And that might be in really looking at different business models or process changes, like using natural refrigerants, which are more energy efficient. If you look internationally, Octopus Energy and Quilt, those are interesting companies. One's a startup, one's more established. They're designing their own heat pumps just because they want them to be more aesthetically pleasing. So what they're doing there, it's not like they're trying to innovate on the manufacturing end as much as they're trying to innovate on the marketing and delivery of heating service. So how can we think about it perhaps that way in Canada, about developing specific areas of strength and advantage, or just getting the benefits of energy efficiency? And then smart thermostats, again, if they're going to lose an export market, how can we support some of these technologies domestically? A lot of demand side management programs are already giving away thermostats for free. They're integrating them within customer opportunities to get paid for things like demand flexibility and decreasing system peaks. Okay, after we looked into this, I feel pretty comfortable saying that energy efficiency is a very made in Canada energy resource. A lot of it is produced domestically. There are relatively few, I think, comparatively trade dependencies. And there's lots of options where we do trade to bring stuff from global supply chains that are quite competitive. And we've got in Canada the kind of engineering expertise, the program expertise to work around potential supply chain disruptions. But there are opportunities to make those supply chains even more Canadian, even more innovative. And the kind of overarching strategy that would be beneficial to do that, it would be to grow and coordinate demand for energy efficiency products and services. And so that's important, right? If supply chains can be provided with a clear and stable demand pattern, we can perhaps transform those supply chains to become more productive and perhaps more Canadian. And we have a bunch of existing policy tools that could help us do that. One is demand side management portfolios, which are starting to ramp up across the country. We've also got codes and standards. We've got forums like local energy efficiency partnerships that bring together builders and manufacturers. And one area that we'd like to call out specifically are federal programs that are around retrofit accelerators, or what's called the Greener Neighborhood Pilot Projects. And these are programs that were based on the idea of market development teams. And at Efficiency Canada, we feel pretty like we helped influence the creation of those within some of our previous thought leadership. And the original idea there was that these market development teams were to aggregate demand and then use that demand signal to transform energy retrofit markets and those supply chains to retrofit faster and higher performance, right? And actually, the person, Tom, who's going to speak at this webinar originally, is actually doing that. The same strategy of kind of growing and coordinating demand could also have an impact if we want to build out more Canadian diversified, innovative supply chains. So I think it's worthwhile perhaps going back to that original idea and thinking about those market development teams, how they could perhaps be relevant now to a Canadian self-reliance agenda. Okay, so that's what we've been thinking of. That's what we've been doing since the United States went crazy. This is a report that is not yet published, so stay tuned when it comes out, and please share it with policymakers or anyone else you find interested. And hopefully it can help us deal with our nation's current economic and political challenges.
Awesome. Great. Thank you, Brendan. That's the second time I've seen that presentation, and it was just as good as the first time. We've got 4 questions in the Q&A box. I'm going to give people a couple minutes to collect their thoughts. There's a lot to digest. I've got a question myself, and I'm going to exercise my prerogative as facilitator to ask it first. Brendan, what are the implications of this research for any kind of like Buy Canada campaigns that maybe are impacting or the energy efficiency sector in any way?
Yeah, I'm not too sure to the extent they are. The only thing I mean, with some governments have given, I don't know if they're even directives, but kind of direction to their governments and sub-agencies to either not buy United States things or to buy more Canadian things. And I think that would a lot of demand side management programs or like crown corporations, utilities and things like that they would probably fall under that directive. So yeah, so I'm hoping if that is the case, then maybe this research can help them a bit. But even doing things like presenting a label of this is the Canadian product, this isn't the Canadian product, could be valuable for people that would maybe have access to incentives and would have the choice of what to buy.
Great, thanks. Okay, so we've got a question here from Tom. Is there a list of Canadian companies manufacturing HRVs, ERVs, EPS foam, etc.? Looking for the actual company names.
Yeah, so that'll be in the report. But we are very careful to say these are not all the companies. We are giving examples of companies because, as I said, we went out, found what we could, took a bottom-up approach. This isn't like a census of all companies in Canada. But yeah, we have some of those names. And actually, if you look at, I can't look them up now, but if you look at Carol Moss's LinkedIn, she actually just did a post on HRVs and highlighted some of the key Canadian development, manufacturing, and companies that do HRVs.
Okay, great. Thanks, Brendan. The next question, I think this is actually, in a way, germane to the project. So Garnett asks, is EC, Efficiency Canada, tracking what's happening with Energy Star Portfolio Manager? And if so, what do we know and when will we know more? It's a little tangential, but
Yeah, no, I think it's in the theme of the United States going crazy. So yeah, we definitely are tracking this. Sarah Riddell and Betsy Aga are the main people on our team looking at this closely. Sarah was quoted in an article on this recently. So yeah, there still is a lot that we don't know just off the top of my head. The main thing, like Energy Star is a trademark. The United States owns the trademark, so there might be some issue of if Canada can use the trademark. My understanding is the data of the actual buildings on Portfolio Manager is housed within Canada, but people are also encouraged to back up their own data if you contribute data, if you're a building operator. So the data is relatively safe, and the software system that does it is contracted out, and potentially like Canada can have access to that. But it brings up like a larger agenda, which is that in this, a whole bunch of testing, certification, data management for yes, buildings, but also appliance and equipment, Canada has tended to partner with the United States on those things and partner with that infrastructure. And it might be time for thinking about, does Canada have to do its own thing here? And so that is something that we're trying to think through. And if anyone has any ideas on, maybe there's some advantages to Canada doing its own thing and perhaps having a more politically stable energy efficiency label out there than what exists in the United States, that would be relevant not just to Canada, but some of the American states and municipalities that want to continue to advance energy efficiency.
great. Thanks, Brendan. Okay, so here's a question. I think you spoke a little bit about this in parts in the presentation, but I'm curious to get your thoughts. When we talk about made in Canada resources, particularly energy resources, I think like it's easy for people to understand some things as being energy, Canadian energy resources, oil and gas or something like that. And but also people would make the case like we should focus on SMRs because it could be a uniquely Canadian technology to export to the rest of the world. So the question for me is, I guess, I I wonder the extent to which there's connections with this work or opportunities to in thinking about how to communicate or whether there is an opportunity, I guess, when we talk about energy efficiency as a made in Canada resource to develop the sector for like export market opportunities. Maybe I'm can do things that shouldn't be connected, but
Yeah, I think so. And that's why, when we look at those columns, we increasingly said like this column on intellectual property, innovation, that is a really important one, right? Because I think like often what we might export, it might be the physical products in some cases, and I can try to give examples of those, but often it is the kind of intellectual property, if you will, around like design, right? Or around some sort of technological, a new way of doing things technologically. So we see that like I'm gonna not do service to it here, but like in the report, we see universities again like exploring completely removing refrigerants from heat pump systems, right? We see a McMaster spinoff that has a process for capturing heat from like pizza ovens. We're seeing new ways to recycle styrofoam. These are all like patents and technologies that exist in Canada. And again, like I think we go back to the thermostat story, that those are Canadian technologies that were designed here in Canada, and they are exporting. They're exporting quite a bit. And again, the real value add on the Canadian side has been more in the design and marketing of those types of products. So yeah, I think you do see aspects of that. But the other aspect of it is if we think it's in Canada's strategic interest to have the capability to export more electricity or export even more like oil and gas and stuff, right? Actually, a way to do that is to use less of that at home, be more efficient the way we do that at home so that we actually free up the potential to do those exports. So it actually, like in the report, we mentioned how the value added of Canada's traditional energy exports is improved if we increase energy efficiency domestically.
Oh, great. Thank you. Okay, got a question here from Lucas. Do you accept and recognize certificates against EU-Canada CETA agreement? I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's not something that we honestly got too into. Like we didn't really get into the details of trade agreements and what would be tariffed, what wouldn't be tariffed, etc. We actually just figured we want to understand no matter what happens with those trade agreements and tariffs, like is how self-reliant is Canada, how resilient is Canada in the nature of its supply chains in these particular areas. That's what we tried to understand. So fortunately, I can't really answer that question.
Okay, so question from Carol. Can you say more about what coordinating demand could look like in Canada?
Sure. I think I'd go back to there's the original idea of those market development teams. The original idea of those market development teams were to say what the supply chain sees is going to look different if they're getting orders building to building versus if they're getting orders from like 1,000 buildings, all of which, and of those, these are the buildings that are all going to need to upgrade their HVAC systems in these years. And so that, and the example that we often use with Energy Sprong, which is out of the Netherlands, is that they wanted this kind of all-in-one HVAC system, and it wasn't, no one made it. It wasn't available on the market. But because they could aggregate demand to such an extent and say, if this product is made, these are the people who are going to buy it, they created a new company out of that. So that's the kind of thing that you can do when you scale and coordinate demand. And that was the original idea behind those market development teams. I don't think they're supported at a level that allows you to do that. So that's why I'm suggesting that it might be a time to rethink that.
Great, thanks, Brendan. Okay, so a question from Jesse, and this isn't specific to the market development teams, but just in general related to the project and this issue. What is Efficiency Canada doing to engage the new federal government on this topic?
The main thing we've been doing is the new federal government is in process of being constructed. So we're not entirely sure, like the political staffers and stuff don't quite have their jobs yet and stuff. But we are hoping to produce this report quite quickly and hopefully provide it as a resource to some of the new people in the government to understand like where energy efficiency fits within, I think, probably the main theme that the government is tasked with at this point. And then the other thing we do frequently is Emily on our team, she is always on the lookout for people who are willing to meet with their local members of parliament, to write letters on particular issues, to respond to different calls to actions. When the report comes out, sharing it with your local member of parliament can be a big deal. It can have a big influence. I think we're going to be asking people to do that.
Great. Okay, question from Leaf. You've covered some opportunities to unlock innovation, not only with regards to energy efficiency, but also recycling materials. What measures are needed to move Canada's building sector further towards waste diversion and circular economy in demolition and retrofit?
That's a great question. That is another report that we did not write. I would say this is how far we got is, we looked at where's insulation come from? Oh, wow, insulation comes from a whole bunch of like ubiquitous materials. And actually, the more you recycle those materials, the more kind of local it becomes in terms of its inputs. But in so many, almost in all cases, the more environmentally responsible it becomes. Like, so for instance, like the more glass is a component of fiberglass, the less energy intensive the production of fiberglass insulation is. Really, on the spray foam side, there's a really interesting use of plastics to create the resin for spray foam. And we actually see some companies like locating close almost to plastic recycling inputs so they can use those. And we also see like patented processes on how to recycle that Canadians are producing. So that's how far we got. We just said, if you want more of this, you should increase recycling. But we didn't really get into the policy system, so to speak, on like how to increase recycling. Unfortunately, maybe Leaf from Green Communities Canada has already written that report. I don't know.
These questions are getting dangerously close to us having to do more work at Efficiency Canada.
Or it's good. New questions are good.
Oh, for sure. I agree. Okay, I only have 3 minutes left. There's a couple questions. I'll just do them quickly. So Liz asks, air to water heat pumps are common in Europe and Asia, but why not in Canada? I don't know if that's part of this research, but
yeah, it is a bit actually. So one thing that like hydronic distribution systems are essentially more common in Europe than in North America. And heating systems have a certain amount of geographic stickiness to them because a lot of heating systems tend to be quite geographic specific. North America has a lot of more air distribution systems, although not everywhere. Asia would tend to use more kind of like side discharge heat pumps. Europe tends to use a lot more like district heating, hydronic heating. That's one of the things we discuss in the report is there's that kind of natural pull, and is there ways to work heat pumps is actually an opportunity to diversify against that. But we also really highlighted that those more, I guess, a lot of those systems like ground source systems, air to water systems, even like things like heat pumps for pools, they're a little bit less internationally commodified than like air to air mini split heat pumps. That's an opportunity for more Canadian involvement. And we actually do see more Canadian involvement. So actually one way we could really benefit by coordinating demand is coordinating demand amongst those, not the super dominant, but more specialized, but still important for Canada types of technologies. That's one thing we should really be looking at doing because it's actually an area that a lot of history of Canadian involvement in things like ground source heat pumps, but also Canadian companies quite involved in those technologies.
excellent.
Hopefully that answered the question. I don't know if it did. I think Carol's in the chat answering all the questions better than I am.
Helping out and answering some questions as well. And actually, we're at, so it's good. I'm going to wrap it up there. But thanks again, Brendan. This is really interesting work that you and Carol have been doing. We're really excited at Efficiency Canada to see it out there in the world. And thank you, everybody, for giving Brendan new research ideas for us to work on in the future and your questions where that was applicable. Okay, so with that, I'll just say thanks again for everybody participating and attending our DiscoverEE webinar. We really appreciate it and looking forward to seeing you at the next one.
Thanks, everyone.